Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Tim Podesta and I am opening the webinar on behalf of the APM Assurance SIG. I've been active in the Assurance SIG for 10 years and I led the working group on developing the measures for assuring projects and the guidance which we'll be sharing with you today. I celebrated 35 years with BP and after completing my time I'm now an independent consultant and I have recent experience as a program director in government projects. And I'll share my experience as part of this webinar. The agenda now is in two parts. I will provide context and introduction to the Measures for Assuring Projects guidance work with a story about its creation, and Matt will then share the Leidos story of use of its guidance. Before we start, let's get the upfront input from yourselves with a poll. You can see here there are 4 questions. And what we want to establish right at the start is what your involvement is in project assurance to get a sense of the range of experience of assurance for those who are joining the webinar. Okay, that's some responses in all the boxes. And the one that's top of the list is I've worked on a project that's been subject to assurance. Now that's very interesting because I'm sure that those of you who have been subject to assurance will have had a range of experiences. So hopefully through this, it'll give you some insight as to the view from an assurance practitioner point of view. And I see we have about 11% who are full-time assurance practitioners. And I'm very keen at some point, if we were able to link up with yourselves to get your views in more detail on the tool. Slide which shows the 3 lines of defense. I'm sure many of you have heard of that term. 3 lines of defense, and this is a model which the Assurance SIG have used. Roy Millard, our chair, has used it in a number of presentations, so I'm hoping it's not unfamiliar. But in principle, it shows the 3 lines, which are simply put: first line, control by self-assurance; the second line, compliance by assurance; and the third line, independent review by external audit, all working together. My own recent experience of this was last year when I was on assignment with DEFRA, where I was a program PMO director for a key agency. Now, whilst we were developing the project governance plans and risk management for the EU exit project, a key project which is running across the whole of government, we were subject to the 3 lines, which we saw as being very helpful when seen in perspective and how they work together. First of all, we were audited by KPMG as the 3rd line of defense. We were then also subject to a critical friend assurance review by IPA, which is an example of the 2nd line. And as we developed governance and risk management processes and a risk register, they very much fell into the area of self-assurance. Now, as we look at the measures for assuring projects as part of this webinar, my strong view is that they can actually facilitate and work within the 3 lines of defense very well. Now, to get some further input for yourselves, as we start to focus down on the measures for assuring projects, we have another poll. And this, I'm hoping to establish from those of you who kindly joined the webinar, your familiarity with the guidance, whether you've downloaded the document, indeed whether you may have used the document as a reference, maybe even you actually used the guidance, some of the tools which the Measures for Assuring Projects describes. So take a few seconds while you select one which may be relevant to your experience, and we'll have a look. Right, well, that's not untypical, and it's great that those of you who've been able to join the webinar are getting the chance to become familiar. It's good to see a number of you have downloaded and have used it as a reference, and actually some of you have actually used it as guidance. We're very keen to reach out and connect with those who have either used the document as a reference or as guidance, because we are working to develop a user network. And we've had a couple of opportunities to have calls with folk who've been using the guidance and to share experience. And in fact, we've got a call in a couple of weeks, let's say 4 or 5 weeks time, where we'll be looking at one of the users doing some sort of peer assist. So we're hoping that's a useful mechanism for supporting the use of the measures for assuring projects. And we're also looking at the possibility of doing a refresh at some point in the future, but maybe more of that later. Moving on to the next slide, for me, what I'm keen to do is to share a story, a little short story about how the measures were created. And it was created by a working group of 7 very experienced practitioners covering a wide range of industries. I would like to describe them as the Magnificent Seven. We were in a meeting room in the TfL offices near St James's Park. And from the fourth floor window, we were actually overlooking the park, and it was a lovely sunny day. In the room, the group included Andrew from Crossrail, Jeff from TfL, Kevin from BA Heathrow, David who was working on IT projects, John who was working on government projects, Philip who was working on the 2012 Olympics at that time, and myself who was representing BP and oil, gas and petrochemical projects. It was the Magnificent Seven ready for action. So I don't know if you can imagine the room. I can almost feel the energy now as I speak, the experience, the view out of the window. Now, the good news was we had 200 years of experience between the seven of us. That's a lot of years. Not so good was when we noted our top 10 criteria for assurance and shared them in turn. They were all different. So my heart sank and I thought, well, how are we going to get a combined list and a common guidance and a tool? Then I remembered my facilitation training. I picked up the pen, approached the flip chart. I sensed the energy in the room and was confident there was a desire to get alignment. And at the flip chart, I proposed the first common subject, scope development. And we were away. From that point, 2 hours later, the first item became client and scope. And after a couple of very intense hours, we came up with the common list of 10 criteria we have today. And you can see that we've moved to that on the screen. Now that was just a start. There was much more work to be done, fleshing out the criteria, establishing an evidence list and some tools. But at that meeting, we'd made a great start. The 10 criteria you can see on the screen there. Just stepping through them. Client and scope, in my view, one of the key things you need in the front end of a project. It needs to be clear and complete, it needs sufficient definition, and it's critical for the setup of a project for success. Secondly, risks and opportunities, covering risk management throughout the project. Thirdly, the area of planning and scheduling, where you really need to be resource loading and have integrated plans. Fourth, another key part of setting a project up for success is the organization of capability and culture, the project team. Fifth, the supply chain, procurement, logistics. Sixth, solution, the deliverables and outcomes, particularly for IT or transformation projects. Seventh, finance, commercial and funding. Eighth, social responsibility and sustainability, which includes environmental impact and health and safety. Now this item is normally number one for projects in a high hazard environment. When I go back to my own personal experience in oil and gas, the criteria around health and safety and environment is number one and was at the top of the list for BP. Number 9, performance, which is around measurement and the tracking and the setting of management actions. And 10, last but not least, governance, which both underpins and is overarching. It covers aspects around sponsors and stakeholders. So that's the key criteria slide. One of the key elements within the document, Measures for Assuring Projects, is what I call the 10 by 10 matrix slide. And that's the next. A lot of words on here, but you can see it's 10 by 10. There's a red, amber, green rating. And I would commend you to look at the document for more detail. I will give you one quick worked example. To sort of set the tool, it is a measurement out of 100. And if you look at the full slide, we actually used this in a working session as part of a master's course at UCL. I did some work with Dr. Andrew Edkins, and we used the guidance alongside a case study that been studying dare I say, the infamous Edinburgh Tram project. And the case study was related to its situation at the point of recovery when there was a need to stop the project and reset it. So to do the case study, we got the class split into several groups and set to take up roles. The roles you might have in an assurance situation. You had the project manager, the assurance facilitator, technical lead, commercial lead. And we gave the groups a couple of hours to review the project and actually go through an exercise of measuring the assurance of the project using the scale. The really good news for me and the feedback we got was that the scoring and the approach to the assurance, we got very, very good alignment across the different groups in terms of where they thought the project was in terms of assurance. However, there was one area of difference, and this is sort of highlights both the utility within the toolkit, but also assurance is not just a science. There's some judgment and art around it as well. The area of divergence was on risk management. You can see here on the screen, we've focused in on one aspect of the 10 by 10 matrix. We're looking here at risks and opportunities and the distinction between something that might be acceptable or with the deficiencies. A number of the groups felt that in reviewing the project in the case study, they felt that risk management was acceptable on the basis it was set up for success in the future. Other groups felt that it was a deficiency because of what had happened in the past. And this is where judgment and assurance comes in, and a good example of the art of doing assurance. So as well as the evidence, you have the judgment. So that's a little bit of a sense of just drilling into how the toolkit is set up and how it showed up in a particular example. But now for a real example. And this is where I have the pleasure of handing over to Matt from Leidos. And I have to say, this is the best example I've come across of practical use of measures for assuring projects, but also as a way of sharing how assurance used systematically can make quite a difference to the success or likely success of a project. I'll come back later to help with the Q&A session, but now I have the great pleasure introducing Matt, who will give you the Leidos example.
Thank you, Tim. As Tim's introduced, my name's Matt Bruce-Kingsmill. I was the delivery manager for the MyCase program for 2 years within a collaborative approach or delivery between Leidos and Scottish Government. I'm also joined on the line by Colin Napier, who is our technical assurance advisor within the team. And Colin will talk a little bit more shortly around some of the work that we've done in the technical space. Other key people who were involved were Ken and Andrew, who you'll see on the screen. Unfortunately, neither of them were able to be with us today, but were equally involved in the work that we were doing. So, who are Leidos? I did have a YouTube video for people to look at, which gives you a much better feel for who Leidos are, but unfortunately due to some technical challenges I wasn't able to get the audio playing through today's webinar, so I've at the last minute taken some text and have given you the text here along with the link to the video underneath. But ultimately, Leidos, growing company and specializing in delivering complex solutions to complex challenges to support critical national infrastructure. So what is the MyCase program? At its heart, it was a business transformation program looking at how Scottish Government handled its correspondence, but there was some customized software developed within it, but there's a little bit more. I have got a video, again, apologies for no audio, but this one I think is still valuable. So it'll take about 90 seconds just to run through some different slides. So hopefully that's given you a feel. That video was produced internally by Scottish Government as a way of warming up the different business areas ready for it coming out. But part of what we were looking at was, as I said, changing the way that Scottish Government approached correspondence and processed it internally. So why were we looking at the toolkit? Part of our funding model required us to have an integrated assurance plan. However, the templates and process that were provided were very much about providing assurance up the way within the corporate governance structure. They didn't give that much in the way of value to the program delivery team itself in terms of helping us with our deliveries. And we wanted to incorporate an activity that would actually give us day-to-day value within the program, as well as providing that governance level of assurance. So we looked around at a number of different things, but we came across the Measures for Assurance toolkit. When we were looking through it, actually, we felt that this had a really rounded view of all the different aspects of the program that we were looking at. And so we decided to adopt this and use this. Now, our use of it has maybe not been in the same way that a lot of people might consider using it, in that Ken, as the SRO, myself as the delivery lead, used this primarily as a self-assessment tool. So sort of that first line of defense that Tim was talking about earlier, and we would do it when we did it on a repetitive basis once every month to really just step back. And actually that was one of the key benefits from it, was the fact that by committing to doing it, it gave Ken and myself time to step back and look at the bigger picture of where we were as part of the program. However, given that there was a technical software delivery component as well, we felt we needed something that would look at how that was progressing as well, because it was very much a bespoke development. And this is where Colin came in, and I gave him the original APM toolkit, and I asked him to work up a technical framework for technical software delivery assurance as well. Colin will speak on that a little bit more shortly. I'm not going to dwell on this because obviously you've seen it in Tim's slides already, but we brought the tables from the toolkit through into a workbook that we put together that enabled us to make things repeatable and give us some trend analysis over time. Here's an example of the client and scope indicators, but these then came into the result sheets that we filled in. So this was a blank one. When we put the score in, we pulled it through, and then we had an area to record our evidence. Now, one of the key things I'd mention at this point is, as well as us doing self-assessment and that first line of defense, we had an independent assurer come in. As part of their engagement, we did ask them to work with the toolkit as well as doing their detailed deep dive reports, and we'll come back to that, but the toolkit equally supported their work at the third line of defense as well. Here's an example, and this is a genuine example of a report that we had about 14 months ago, and this was from our independent assurer. Now, I've deliberately called this one out because we've heard Tim talk about the risks and opportunities piece. Again, you can see in Keith's report here that we didn't score particularly well. When I dug into this, or when Ken and I dug into this, it transpired Keith hadn't been given sight of the risk registers, which is hence his scores. When we did go back through, we then, the scores were adjusted accordingly by Keith once he had reviewed the content in the risk registers. So an output from that was, at the summary level, a set of scores that we could present in this sort of dashboard format, and this formed part of our monthly report up to our program board and above. And the feedbacks we got from both them and from the corporate governance board was that they found this sort of review slide really beneficial and helped them target in on key areas for discussion. And as you can see, it progressed over time, but it really was quite consistent in terms of the scoring. And as the slide calls out, buried within it is the independent assurance line's outputs, which was the 23rd of March, 18 scores, and you'll see that on the whole, actually, their scores correlated quite closely with how the scores we were getting coming out the self-assessment from Ken as SRO and myself as the delivery manager. And therefore, we found that really good sort of background validation of some of the bits and pieces that we were doing. Now, was it a perfect answer? Did we get it exactly right? Probably not, but we found it added value to what we were doing and our overall delivery. And I think that showed in some of the governance scores and the feedback we got from the board and the level of reassurance they had that this would be a successful delivery. One of the other benefits and where we're now going with it is actually within the program context, as well as using it at that program level, is trying to use it at multiple levels and rolling the scores up. And this model's straight out of the toolkit in terms of this visual, but you can use it at a project level and then aggregate the scores up to either a program or a portfolio level. And again, that works quite well within that systematic piece. I'm now going to pass over to Colin, who's going to just talk through a little bit more around the technical assurance piece, though I may jump back in at one point.
Thanks, Matt. I'll try to remember which point you jump in at. Afternoon, everybody. So yes, as Matt was saying, he was using the APM Insurance Toolkit and he challenged me to extend it to cover the technical side of the project. So there were some challenges with this as an agile project. I wanted this to be reflected in my reports. Okay, I've been involved in my case for a number of years in a number of roles, but most recently technical assurance, but I had been a solution architect at some point as well.
Okay, this is where I jump back in. Most people won't be able to read this, but it is the Agile Manifesto in Gaelic. Part of the reason for putting this up in Gaelic and then moving it into English is that IT programs often, the technical teams and the business teams feel like each other is speaking a different language, and that's a challenge that we've had to overcome on a number of fronts. Now I'll pass back to Colin.
Okay, so as I said, it was an agile software project. So the first thing I did was have a look at the agile site and just take a few pertinent points from it that I wanted to look at. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but just, let's say, highlight a couple of points. So prioritizing working software, so that's a given and quite easily measurable. But in an agile project, you also have to look at items like velocity, complexity, and measure that the team is actually functioning well. Fluid requirements, reacting to them. So that's the agile piece, I guess. So looking at the backlog and things like that. Frequent delivery of working software. This is a life cycle of the flavor of agile being implemented. In my case, that was Scrum. Continuous attention to technical excellence and good designs. Enhances agility. So this is a more traditional assurance, technical assurance piece that you'd expect. So that's looking at quality of design code, ensuring checks are there, tests, all the good things that you'd expect on a well-managed project. At regular intervals, the team reflects on how to become more effective, then tunes and adjusts its behavior accordingly. This is something that I wouldn't expect to measure in technical assurance traditionally, you know, if it's a waterfall project or evolutionary prototyping stage delivery kind. But they're so key to a properly functioning agile team that I felt that some thought had to go into considering how the team interacted with each other and the customer, how issues were resolved, lessons learned, and subsequently how these influenced the technical work and impacted on its quality. Motivated individuals, this is key for any project, but felt again that this really needed to be considered within the agile sphere, and face-to-face communication, so how the team communicated, and actually as one of the examples, the fact that face-to-face was actually highlighted is very important for this particular project. So having had some thoughts of what I wanted to measure, the next step was to get some indicators, and I'm not proud, so I just borrowed the ones from the toolkit. So as you'd expect, green is good, blue is best, red's a problem, and yellow is worth watching. How closely you watch it depends on which way it's going. So nothing too radical there. So having the what and the indicators, now I had to look at the criteria, and this is what I came up with. So scope, so this was to look at the state of the backlog, how well it was being groomed, And I'll discuss this in another example in the next slide, in the subsequent slides. Risks and opportunities, examining the state of the risk log, concentrating, ensuring agile ceremonies did provide opportunities, and all parties got their say. Discussions were open and to the point, so that's really measuring quite a bit of the agile process. Planning and scheduling, again looking at the agile ceremonies this time to see how accurately sprints were planned. Ensuring stories adopted in a good state and reviews are taking place with the work completed, including estimation. On the scheduling side of things, where the technical assurance differed from the project assurance was that the project assurance, the toolkits and the reports were filled out at the end of every month. So it was a monthly reporting cycle. I felt with the technical assurance, we had to reflect again the agile rhythm that was taking place within the team. So the team had found themselves liking 3-week sprints. So the technical assurance was also done as on a 3-weekly basis and as part of the one of the outputs that occurred as part of the sprint conclusion. Solution, more concentrating there, you would think, as I say, traditional assurance. So that's all the code reviews, design decisions, bug rates, things like that. But there's also a bit of making sure that agile ceremonies are adhered to. Deployment, the ambition of the project was to have one-touch deployment throughout. So this was quite an easy one to be tested at the conclusion of each sprint, because in common with most agile projects, we had a demonstration box, a demo which would invite all the interested parties to at the end of each sprint. So how difficult it was to deploy to that demo box gave us an indication of how far along we are with that. Documentation. One of the most common questions I get asked as a technical person regarding Agile is whether documentation is required. So I decided to specifically call this out, and I'll go into more detail on this one on a slide or two. Example scope. So this is an example of the measures that we had. As you can see, the first one's really to do with how user stories are aligned with business need and scope. The second one is looking at the catalogue of user stories that we have. And the third one is how good a quality they are, how much more input are we requiring actually from the business in order to get these stories to the point where they can be adopted into a technical sprint. Okay, as I mentioned before, documentation in Agile. This is a Scottish Government project, so of course they expected a high level of documentation. So for technical assurance, I split the measures into 3 parts. Firstly, we had to demonstrate that we're actually keeping up with the documentation we were expected to deliver. Then we need to demonstrate we were following our own review, check, approve process for documents issued to the client. So that was looking at Leidos' internal. And finally, making sure all in-flight documentation was up to date. So that's the documentation that we're not expected to deliver at the moment, but would reflect, delivered later. So we're talking about things like functional catalogs, stuff like that. But as we'll see on the next slide, although I was measuring documentation, documentation was still a bit of a problem, keeping up with it. So this is the technical assurance piece measurement, very, very similar to the one that Matt's already showed you in the toolkit. I think there's a couple of things to notice. First of all, I mentioned the documentation. You'll see that it never gets out of yellow and it goes into red occasionally. When it does go into yellow, that shows an actual effort, and the whole thing didn't actually go into green until we put on a senior resource towards the end of the project to actually get the documentation up to date. Other things to notice, risks and opportunities. You'll notice that they go quite a lot of yellow there at the beginning. That was the start of people coming into the project, new people coming on. So we had a core team, and that core team was extended, and that just reflects the time that the team were taking to get up to speed. The other one that's of interest, and I mentioned the face-to-face communication side of things, is a blip on the 3rd of April 2018. That was caused by a snowfall in Edinburgh, which closed the Edinburgh office. And then when the snow melted, the snow came through the roof and flooded the Edinburgh office. So people had to work from home, and that resulted in a drop in productivity simply because people weren't face-to-face. So all those little issues and everything like that weren't being picked up quite as well and quite as naturally as you'd expect on an Agile project. And I think that's all from me.
Okay, thanks, Colin. So as we've already touched on a couple of the benefits that Leidos has found and Scottish Government found through using the toolkit. But I think the first one, as we sort of already touched on, was the protected time to focus on that wider delivery picture and giving us time to just sort of reassess where we were at. I think hopefully we've demonstrated to you that it gave us a repeatable and light touch approach for self-assessment, but that was robust and auditable, that we could tailor it with relative ease, and hopefully Colin's comments and presentation has illustrated a worked example there of how we did tailor it, and that it's relatively straightforward and easy to roll up to the different management layers. And then finally, that it's consistent and comparable regardless of who is undertaking the review. Now, on the whole, the delivery reviews were done by myself or Ken, but there were a couple of times when we were unavailable for whatever reason, but rather than it not happening, someone else picked it up, and actually the scores they came out with were very close. And similarly with the technical reviews that Colin did, there was a period during the program when he took a 2 to 3 month sabbatical and someone else was covering, and you wouldn't have known that from just looking at the scores, because as I said, it came out with a very fair and robust overview. Right, that is in a nutshell what we've done, and we are over to yourselves for any questions.
Thank you. And presentation of the actual real example. And I'm hoping that will stimulate some questions. Right, so question from Sarah. And this one's close to my heart. It's around assurance measurements when you're at the stage of handing over projects to operations. And she's asking what sort of experience, what sort of measurements we might consider using, particularly around business readiness. Now, I'm just going to answer this in 2 parts. I will give my particular perspective from the toolkit, where whilst the toolkit looks primarily at assurance through the project, and at its startup through to delivery, the operations handover is key. And looking at the criteria, it is covered in the sense if you are strong on organizational capability, you have strong team input from the key people, maintenance and operations. That makes a big difference. And on that item 6 solution, where it does specifically call out exemplary operations input with continuity in the operations phase. My particular experience of oil and gas industry is you do have specific assurance leading up to handover, to startup, under the banner of operations readiness. And normally you might have specific experts coming in helping at that stage. That's my experience of operational startup and assurance of business readiness. Matt, what would you add to that in your context?
Yeah, I think you've sort of covered the key bits in that it is covered in a couple of the different section headings, but it was also something that on the agile front within the technical framework, that was all about having deployable, ready to go code is one of the principles of the agile methodologies and regular release. So it's something that pervaded a number of Colin's indicators as well. I think it's something which, again, you can tailor to the specific circumstances that you're using it for. And if you feel you need more emphasis in a certain area, add them in.
Okay, hope that's helpful, Sarah. Question from Samuel around probably the technical aspects that Colin shared around the use in an agile environment, and he asked, do you see this working for 1 week sprints, or did you need a few weeks to make the turnaround to generate this? I think that's probably looking at your experience of assurance and the sort of quick sprint cycle.
Yeah, so it took a little while to actually get used to it. Again, it's with anything else, it takes a few attempts to get used to how your measurements are and everything like that. But once I worked out how we were going to measure things, it actually only took about half a day effort to actually produce a technical assurance for each sprint. So it would be possible to do it for 1 week sprints. Whether you'd want to actually have that amount of reporting, I'm not sure, but that depends. On that's the beauty of agile, is that you make it fit how your team wants to work.
Okay, thank you for that, Colin. Next question, and this is one close to my heart because it tackles the involvement of sponsors and stakeholders. And Claire is asking that, Matt, you mentioned protected time to carry out the work. How did you ensure the senior stakeholder had buy-in to allow time to carry it out effectively?
Yeah, great question. I think this ties into a couple of the other questions that we've had as well. And it was very much about having an SRO and sponsor who was engaged from the off and was heavily engaged in what we were doing, rather than a sort of more remote, distant sponsor. We had a sponsor who was very hands-on, so it was actually quite an easy sell with Ken to get him to spend the time doing it with us. He certainly, once we'd been through it 2 or 3 times, saw a lot of value in the discussions we were having, so kept re-engaging. I'm not sure if that's answered your question, but I hope it has.
Thank you, Matt. And another one for you. It's about sharing the results of the self-assessment with the team. Did you, and how did the results affect the project team? And interesting, Brenda also gives you some guidance on your pronunciation in Gaelic here, but maybe that's something for offline. So anyway. Indeed,
no problem. So yeah, in terms of sharing with the team, everything was open and transparent with the team, and everything was uploaded within the project area that everyone had access to. But that was part and parcel of the model that we were working within with that project team. Was everything was very open and transparent from the off, which I think it also helped with the buy-in for undertaking these processes.
Okay, thank you for that. Question from Stuart, and this is around the process for using the toolkit or the guidance, and how you use red, amber, green RAG scores without losing important details. And clearly there is a risk if you have an item which is red, you don't want to lose that. And one of the parts of the guidance is that where you might have a result from your 10 by 10 matrix for your measurement, if you do have any item that's red, it should be flagged. And in terms of passing muster at a review stage, any project with red flags do need to be addressed rather than just looking at the overall score. That would be my answer to that. What was your experience, Matt?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. It's a very valid observation. Any sort of roll-up risks losing an outlier flag from lower down. But I think at the same time, this is where, as you said, the escalation paths should be there to address those issues. But on the whole, we found that it did lend itself. If you were scoring things in the right way, things were fairly consistent, and we have been emphasizing that people need to deal with the issues at their level, and then and use the escalation routes to the next tier up to get help, and call it out as an exception within there as a bullet point on the summary.
Yep. Thank you for that, Matt. Probably a question for Colin here. It's going down the agile route, and I think I'm going to learn something here, hopefully as well. Question from Artiha. I hope I've said that correctly. He's asking about the agile methodology clearly allows for fluid requirements, but his concern, or their concern, is, does that mean doing double work when the client changes their mind after the sprint has started? Or how might you handle that? And maybe is there an assurance aspect to this as well?
So the short answer is that yes, you could end up doing double work, and certainly over the lifetime of my case, which lasted for 3 years, I was working on it. There were pieces of functionality that drifted into scope and were done and then drifted back out and were removed from the product and drifted in. So the possibility of doing double work. That's the nature of fluid requirements and prioritizing things. As for measuring it and seeing what's happening with that with assurance, we had a look at the scope side of things when we're going through the slides. What I didn't mention was how we'd measure that, and one of those was by monitoring the rate of story creation. So we could see whether we were getting towards the end of the sort of the functional catalog, the user stories, simply by the number of stories that were still coming out of the business and comparing that. And as you can imagine, initially that was grew hugely, and then plateaued for a little while and then dropped off, and eventually there was only a few being created. So that's how we measured whether or not we're getting to the point where we actually understood exactly what it was that the business was looking for us to build. Does that answer the question?
Thank you very much, Colin. I think that's helpful.
Okay.
There is time for more questions. If any, one or two burning questions come up, I still have a few on this list here to go through. And the next one is from David. And this is a good one for yourself, Mark, because it's probably looking to your future use of the tool, and it's using it for portfolio projects. And how much resource does it require to carry out the process in your experience or in your expectations? And how might it be constrained by the size of the assurance team?
Yeah, great question. I think in terms of how we've used it, it's very much been a self-assessment tool within the delivery team. So we would be looking for making it available to the PM or the delivery manager for each project or program at that level, and then wrapping them up. So it would need some automated tooling to do the wrap up. We're not part of the reason we haven't rolled it out yet is exactly this. We don't want to burden and create an administrative burden on people, but we need to try and find a way to get something that's usable at this level. So we're very much finding our way with this still, and it's a work in progress. We've not by no means got all the answers with it. I think, and it's something which has worked for us. Will it work for everybody? Maybe, maybe not.
Okay, that's a good question.
Sorry, I'm probably been a bit evasive.
Well, I think you're being honest, and I would say as part of the ongoing user group, we look forward to hearing how you get on, because I think that's one of the things I'm keen to get out of this webinar is establish or extend that network as an opportunity to learn and share. Okay, question from David, which I missed came in one of the early ones, and he's asking about the guidance toolkit, how it fits with other assurance frameworks such as P3M3. And my answer to that is it differs in the sense it focuses on the project rather than the overall project environment, as it were. And as such, it certainly, I think, is complementary. There is one area we're looking at potential future development of the guidance, and that's in enhancing it in its use as part of programs and portfolios, and as well as bringing it up to date with recent guidance that's out there, particularly from the government environments. Yes, it is the toolkit does complement other frameworks which looks at maturity. Right, and okay, looking at the time, we've still got time for a couple more questions, I think. And question from Leighton around the spreadsheet. And the actual spreadsheet that's in the PDF document you can download, there is an Excel version available, not available directly from the APM website. If you want access to that, then please respond to the feedback email. We can try and get you a copy of that. But certainly the actual PDF document is available from that. A question here around its use in the NHS. Now, I'm not aware of the toolkit having been used. I know it's being used in other sort of government areas. I think the Treasury are looking at using it in some of their projects, but I'm not aware of its use in the NHS environment.
So just on that, Tim, yes. Colin and I gave this same presentation at a conference a couple of weeks ago where we had a number of members of the NHS in the audience, and they were talking about wanting to look at using it in a number of areas and start digging into it a bit more.
Okay, well that's good to hear, and there may well be examples in the future then. Good, excellent question from Melanie. What type of organization would you use to do external assurance? And now, if we're making a distinction between audit and external, and the third line, and assurance on the second line, there's this, I would say you'd either be using a resource which is made available by your organization more generally, maybe the central organization, or if you wanted to bring external experts in, then there are experts out there, people who can help with facilitation and can be part of providing useful assurance. I think the key thing there is finding the right people who can give you consistency in their approach. Any thoughts on that, Matt? Who would you go to externally?
Yeah, so in terms of the context of the MyCase program that we put up, our external assurance was done by another public sector body within Scotland, or a member staff from another public sector body within Scotland, who was procured on a short-term engagement on 2 separate occasions to do those deep dives. But it was something which part of the reason he was selected as part of that was his standing within the public sector within Scotland, and the fact that we knew he would give us a tough time, but a very fair time.
Okay.
Again, I'm not sure if I've fully answered your question, but.
Well, I think you've shared your experience of it, which is helpful. And I think one of the early questions that came in was from Lynn. And would the presenters be willing to share their tools with us? Now, I've talked about the actual guidance, APN guidance. And probably the question is for yourself, Matt, how might they, someone who was particularly interested, maybe access or get some more input from what you've shared? When
we send this out, Maya, if you can include my contact details to people by email, and then if people reach out to me, we can engage offline.
Thank you for that. And obviously, once again, to make the plug for people who are interested in when they get into actually using the toolkit, either as a reference or even using it to do scoring for assurance, then please let us know and get involved in the user group. I think we've got time for one more question. This is always a good one to think about, is where things might not have worked as expected. Did you have any trouble getting buy-in from any level of staff? And certainly my experience is that yes, you always have to do quite a bit of persuading with any process which maybe seems incremental, but if you get support from the sponsor and can be persuasive and show examples, which is why it's great to have the Leidos example here, that can make a difference. Did you have any bother, Matt, in getting with buy-in from everyone?
I guess at times, it came down to the timing of when we were looking to get them involved. So I think if it had been on key sort of deployment days or key rollout days, had we tried to do any assurance activity at that point, we might have got a bit of pushback. But on the whole, the team were really good at engaging with it. But again, they were seeing value from it and seeing the support it was generating up the line as well. So, and I think that's the key thing as to, I think, what enabled it to work really well for us was the open and transparent way in which the project was running. Everyone had visibility of things if they wanted it.
Great. I think that's a great place to stop. Thank everyone so much for their questions and their participation.